All right, well, hello everybody, and welcome to a Mallard Creek High School World History Screencast. Today's topic is the Protestant Reformation. What, when, where, and why important? Now, so as we move forward, the first thing I want us to look at is with our topic, the last word here is reformation. And at the root of the word reformation is a word to reform. And what does it mean to reform something? That simply means to change something to a better state or form, or to improve something by alteration. So again, to reform is to change something to a better state or form, or to improve something by alteration. When we're talking about the Protestant Reformation in history, what is it that we are reforming? What is this something we're trying to improve or change? In this case, it's the Catholic Church. So the Protestant Reformation aimed to reform the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. Why? Let's think about it. As the Catholic Church and the Pope's power and influence increased across Western Europe in the Middle Ages, so too did the level of corruption throughout the Church. Now, corruption is just dishonest conduct by those in power. So corruption, again, is dishonest conduct by those in power. So somebody in a position of power who's lying about what they are doing, or perhaps misusing their power, abusing their power for their own good, that would be an example of corruption. So specifically, what's the Catholic Church doing in the Middle Ages that's so corrupt? Why are people wanting to reform the Church? Several things. And we look at these bullet points, it'll be more clear or be more specific here. First, clergymen who are priests and bishops in the church, high-ranking officials, they were able to buy positions of power in the church rather than earning them. In other words, they could go to a local priest, bishop, somebody in charge, and pay them off in order to have a position in the church of some authority. So they could buy these positions. Instead of just being the most devout person in town, somebody say, oh, well, that person should be priest. They're very devout and a good Christian. Instead, they could buy their position of power. So that's one thing that made people angry. Second, the church embezzled money from townsfolk across Europe. So your local church would sometimes embezzle money from its local townsfolk. And embezzlement is just the stealing of money placed in one's trust. So if you were, for example, the treasurer of a club here at Mallard Creek, and you decided to have t-shirts for your club, if you charged $15 for those t-shirts and everybody paid you, but instead you went out on the weekend and used that money for your own reasons, to buy pizza or something like that, you will have embezzled the money from your club. So that's another thing the church was doing here, embezzling money. Next, during this time period, the church became overly concerned with having ornate, or in other words, fancy, items adorn their buildings and chapels. On the outside of church buildings, on the inside of church buildings, across the top of buildings, windows of the buildings, they were all becoming more ornate, expensive, and fancy during this time. And we'll take a look at an example here. This is a famous church built during the Middle Ages, and this is known as Notre Dame. It's in Paris, France. Now, to worship God, as a Christian would do, nothing necessarily says that you need an incredibly ornate or fancy building to do it in. You just simply need to, worship God in whatever ways that means. But during the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church was becoming more concerned with having very elaborate and ornate buildings, kind of as a way to show off, one, their wealth and power, but also, two, as a way kind of to say, look how much we value and worship God. We worship God and value our religion so much, we're willing to spend all this time and effort to construct these very elaborate churches. On the inside of Notre Dame is another example of this. You can see a famous stained glass window in Notre Dame, and you can see very ornate and very elaborate designs in each of the panels here. So the Catholic Church was becoming more and more concerned with having fancy churches rather than what was going on just inside the church They were concerned with what the church looked like. And this was another reason people were becoming angry. And finally, one thing the Catholic Church did was begin to sell indulgences. So what was an indulgence? An indulgence is a pardon issued by the Pope that people could buy to forgive them of their sins. And again, an indulgence was a pardon issued by the Pope that people could buy to forgive them of their sins. So instead of praying for forgiveness, or perhaps focusing on becoming a better person and hoping God forgives you for your sins, the Catholic Church offered people the ability to buy a piece of paper that would be endorsed by a local priest or bishop or even the Pope that said, "Your sins are forgiven," essentially. Now, this was based in something, a belief in purgatory. And so a Catholic belief was that once somebody dies, their soul can either go to hell, heaven, or purgatory. Now, purgatory is where someone goes to await judgment. Now, if you have a clean sin bill, so to speak, all your sins are forgiven, while you're in purgatory, you will then ascend to heaven. Or perhaps you'll be judged and go to hell. But if you have bought indulgences and your sins are forgiven, that gives you a way to not spend time in purgatory and instead go to heaven. So this is one reason why people were so willing to buy these indulgences. But again, lots of people had a problem with them because you're not really being a good person just by buying something. Now, so when and where did the Reformation begin? All this anger came to a head with the actions. When and where did that occur? While many people across Europe had been unhappy with the practices of the Catholic Church, many were scared to speak out due to threat of imprisonment, excommunication, and meaning separation from the church forever, or even punishment by death. Now, finally, a monk named Martin Luther, who lived in the city of Wittenberg, Germany, he spoke out against the church in 1517. In that year, he nailed 95 theses on the door of Wittenberg's Castle Church, the main church in town. Each thesis in this list of 95 was a separate argument against the practices of the church that we discussed on the previous couple slides. So he nailed his 95 theses on the door, and each was an argument against the church. Wittenberg, Germany, 1517 was the year. As a result, so Luther takes the first step. And as a result of this, people are emboldened, or in other words, encouraged by his actions. Many others across Europe began to voice their frustration with the church as well. And those who supported Luther were protesting or protested against the church, and therefore they became known as Protestants. And therefore we get the name the Protestant Reformation. And finally, do you happen to be a Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist, Anglican, Episcopalian, or other type of Christian other than just Catholic or Orthodox Christian? If so, your form of Christianity traces its roots back to Martin Luther's 95 Theses and the Protestant Reformation. That's where any Protestant religion began. Before the Reformation, there were essentially two ways of being a Christian. You could either be a Catholic, which would apply to most people in Western Europe, or Orthodox Christian, which would have been in Eastern Europe. Other religions existed around the world, of course, but being a Christian meant you were either Catholic or Orthodox. But after the Protestant Reformation begins, Christianity began to splinter into all the different forms that exist and make up Christianity today. Our last thing, your buzzword for watching this presentation, since we discussed fancy items adorning churches, then naturally your buzzword for this will be hashtag Iggy Azalea, since she's so fancy. Hope everybody enjoyed the presentation. Hope you were able to follow along, and good luck in your world history class.